What is history? This is a question that at once seems very simple, but actually has caused significant debate among historians. History is actually not very easy to define. In fact, we can define history in multiple ways. In one sense, and perhaps the most common sense definition, history is simply what happened in the past. Thus, the history of the ancient Near East would simply mean all that happened in the ancient Near East during its existence. Of course, the problem with the definition of this type is that we have very little access to the events of the past. There are no video or audio recordings of anything that happened during this time. In fact, the ability to record sounds was not developed until the late 19th century AD. The first photographs are only a bit older, with crude photography being developed in the 1820s, and the first commercial photographic equipment available only in 1939. Much older is, of course, writing and art, both of which provide information and images about the past. Nevertheless, we simply cannot go back in time and experience the past as we do the present. Most of what happened in the past is, well, history. It's gone, and we'll never know about it. In another sense, history can mean a record of the past or a record of events. This type of history is found in archaeological data, as well as numerous documents from the ancient Near East. Consider one of the earliest historical texts, the Sumerian King List, a text written in the Sumerian language in the cuneiform script on a four-sided clay tablet. This text, the earliest copy of which dates to the 21st century BC, is a list of kings that ruled from the earliest time until the reign of Sin-Magir in the Isin dynasty, about 1817 BC. In this text, kingship descended from heaven. The earliest kings listed had ridiculously long reigns, up to 43,000 years. Of course, much of this text is legendary and likely was written to legitimize the claim of certain rulers. Nevertheless, scholars have used this text in various ways to reconstruct the history of ancient Mesopotamia. But is the Sumerian Kings List history? It records events, names, times, and places, and was a canonical text. Other texts also provide insight into history. For example, sales contracts. We have thousands of sales contracts from the ancient Near East, and specifically Mesopotamia. For example, one text dated to around 2250 BC from the city of Lagash describes the sale of several individuals into slavery. These are real persons. But would this text be considered history? Most likely, many people would not consider the Sumerian King List or the sales contract just described as history per se. Rather, most people would consider them sources of history, or perhaps many would consider them witnesses to particular historical events. They are certainly not well-constructed accounts of events from historians of the likes of Herodotus or Thucydides. This is the type of history with which we are most familiar, a reconstructed story of past events. We may also put many of the biblical texts in this category. John Van Seters, following the historian philosopher Johann Huizinga, has attempted to define this type of history as the intellectual form in which a civilization renders account to itself of its past. From this perspective, we may consider history as a meaningful account of the past. However, these types of histories have shortcomings. Are these histories accurate and reliable? Do they include legendary material or hearsay? Were these types of histories well researched? From this type of history developed the scholarly discipline of history. This is the type of history that you'll be reading in this course, in the two textbooks by Mark Vandermeer. These types of histories are often thought to be unbiased, objective, well-researched, authoritative accounts of the past that are composed on the basis of various ancient source materials and built upon intellectual frameworks and constructs. But of course, every historian is selective. Some things are included, while other things are left out. Some sources are trusted, while others are regarded with skepticism. Every historian is also subjective. Some events are discussed because they hold some value in the historian's mind, but there is absolutely no way to judge one event from the other. In the end, every historian chooses the events he or she includes in an account in order to serve some purpose. Often, a historian does not disclose his or her assumptions or biases. Nevertheless, they exist. But several questions emerge about these types of histories. Can we produce an ultimate history? that is, an authoritative account of an event? Can we ever know something as it happened? Couldn't we find different ancient sources or material that contradict a scholar's reconstruction? What if other scholars have a different perspective? What if a scholar is biased? And what if we do find selectivity and bias in an account? Is the work still history? As this brief discussion has hopefully made clear, it is not actually easy to define history. In fact, there are multiple ways to define history. History is, at one and the same time, an only partially accessible past reality, a literary genre, scholarly discipline, and a meaningful reconstruction. All histories are subjective, selective, and biased. History is a portrait of the past, and not always an accurate or complete portrait. History is reliant upon sources, and is only as good as the sources upon which it relies. For most of modern history, the discipline of history writing has been a sort of history from above. It is focused on major headline-worthy events, and major figures, who have most often been elite males. This old history has been questioned and criticized in the past several decades for leaving much of the world out of the history books. This type of history has been relatively easy to write, since most of the major literary sources focus on these types of people and events. However, more recently, a type of new history has sought to investigate history from the bottom. Recent trends have shown an interest in the daily life of common people, women, minorities, the colonized rather than the colonizers, and has also attempted to use sources other than official documents and records. Problematic for this type of historical investigation is the amount and types of source material. For example, women were not usually the authors of ancient documents, and colonizers and victors often wrote the sources we study. We often therefore have to read between the lines, analyze sources in different ways, and take advantage of types of sources that have not traditionally been used. Another type of history, called the longue durée, seeks to view history from the perspective of long-term patterns and historical structures, such as climate change, migration, and long-term political change. Another relevant question is, when does history begin? And specifically, when does ancient Near Eastern history begin? As Mark van der Meer notes, many scholars consider history beginning with the advent of writing in southern Mesopotamia between 3500 and 3000 BC. This is because written sources are required for the most part to reconstruct events. Time before written sources is often called prehistory. As you can imagine, the world had a history before written sources. Archaeologists and anthropologists, physicists and astronomers, biologists and geologists all study history without written sources, and write histories without written sources. For the historian of the ancient Near East, however, written sources are necessary in order to understand the political and social events, personalities, religious and cult practices, and beliefs. Another logical question then is, when does ancient Near Eastern history end? Many scholars of the ancient Near East consider Alexander's conquest of the ancient Near East in the late 4th century BC as the end point of ancient Near Eastern history. His conquest ushered in a period in which the nature of written sources changed, as well as new cultural and linguistic influences. The fall of Persia in 331 is a useful specific event that provides an easy reference. The next logical question is, how do we know about ancient Near Eastern history? That is, upon what sources do we base a history of the ancient Near East? There are two primary sources, written material and archaeological material. A third source is iconography, and a fourth source is ethnographic comparison. Now that we have discussed the types of sources we use to reconstruct history and understand the ancient Near East, let's now explore the nature of these sources. First, the artifacts and texts we do possess, we have through accidents of history. We have those texts that, because of the material upon which they were written, were 1, preserved, 2, discovered, and 3, for the most part, published. Let's briefly discuss these points. People in the ancient Near East wrote on different types of materials. In ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Megara and Hatti, scribes wrote on clay tablets. Clay, once hardened, becomes almost indestructible. Egyptians, and likely those living in the Levant, most often used papyrus or other organic materials on which to write. These types of materials only survive in the driest of conditions. Other texts were written on shards of clay and ink or carved in stone or metal. Therefore, the preservation of a text depended in part on the type of material on which it was written, and the climate of the area in which the text remained after it was no longer used. It is common to say that archaeology began with Napoleon's campaign into Egypt and Syria between 1798 and 1801. Because of this campaign, Westerners rediscovered the ancient cultures of Egypt and Canaan. Since that time, explorers, professionals, and hobbyists alike have ventured to the ancient Near East to explore and acquire artifacts. Since then, archaeology has become a legitimate and respected science. However, even though scholars, spectators, and thieves have been exploring and excavating the Middle East for more than 200 years, we only possess a small fraction of all that was made throughout the nearly 3,000-year history of the ancient Near East. This is in part due to preservation. This is also due to the fact that it takes an exceptional amount of time, money, and manpower to excavate ancient sites. In the ancient Near East, archaeologists often excavate in locations called tells. These are mounds that have built up over time as successive generations of inhabitants have built new settlements and cities upon the filled-in debris of previous cities. They are often several meters in height and usually have a sort of trapezoid shape. In the ancient Near East, archaeologists often excavate in locations called tells. These are mounds that have been built up over time as successive generations of inhabitants have built new settlements and cities upon the filled-in debris of previous cities. They are often several meters in height and usually have a sort of trapezoid shape. Many tells contain layers or strata, ranging from the Chalcolithic age up to and beyond the Hellenistic age. The lowest portions are the earliest settlements. Many locations have modern settlements upon them. However, archaeologists do not excavate an entire tell. Only a certain percentage of the total surface area, and even less the volume of the tell, are actually excavated, and not all areas are excavated to the same depth. The point is, our knowledge of the ancient world is built upon very limited information at times. And even if an artifact is preserved over time, and an archaeologist discovers that object, there is still one more step or barrier before this object is usable by the majority of scholars and students in the field: publishing. Many more objects have been found than have been published. Publishing also takes time, money, and manpower. Therefore, all three of these factors, preservation, excavation, and publication, are necessary before anyone can begin to use an artifact to write history. Another important topic to address is the issue of dating and chronology. First, it will probably be helpful for some of you to discuss the different ways that scholars refer to dates and time periods. One way is to simply give an absolute date, that is, 3500 BC. This means 3,500 years before the birth of Jesus. The abbreviation BC means before Christ, while AD stands for Anno Domini, or in the year of our Lord. There is no year zero, so a timeline would look like this. Many scholars use the abbreviations BCE and CE, or Before Common Era and Common Era, in place of BC and AD, in order to use references without explicit religious implications. Another issue that often confuses people is the use of the term century or millennium in a relative sense. For example, a scholar may either say that something happened around 3500 BC, or may also say that a thing happened in the mid-4th millennium. These are two ways of saying the same thing. The chart displayed can be used as a reference guide. The way in which we structure knowledge is important. In terms of ancient history, most are probably familiar with the three-part structure of the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age. This system was first put forth by Christian Jurgensen Thompson in 1836 and is prefaced to a museum guidebook. This three-age system is an attempt to structure human history through the lens of the industrial or technological stages of development. Thompson's system is, in many ways, not exact, and doesn't wholly align with the use of these technologies throughout history and throughout the globe. Though his system does match general tendencies in the use of stone, bronze, and iron technologies, so it has been a useful way of referring to various ages of human history. Another system is that which is used by Mark van der Merwe, which focuses on political and social developments, such as the city-state era, territorial state era, and the empires era. As you can see, these three socio-political stages generally fall within the Bronze and Iron Age periods. Understand that most scholars still use Bronze and Iron Ages as useful reference systems. However, also know that the use of technology does not exactly align with the social and political developments of the ancient Near East. Hopefully this introduction to history, its sources, and its structure has provided a helpful orientation to understanding the history of the ancient Near East.